Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. Welcome if you're new here. I read books and make music, so that's more or less what you will find on my channel. Today I want to review what is maybe the highest rated book on my Goodreads TBR overall, and one that has been sitting on my TBR for ages. It's generally been met with a lot of positive reviews. I need to sneeze. It's not coming. Nope. I'm talking about The House on the Cerulean Sea by Klune, which was again on my TBR for ages, and I finally got around to reading it. And so let's start by stating the obvious. This book is lovely. It's really heartwarming, it's cozy, it's a wonderful read, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It kind of feels like a fairy tale, like a little bit of a children's book, in the sense that you know where the book is going, basically basically from the beginning, but a third through, more or less, you really know where the story is going. But that doesn't take away from the enjoyment of the story. We're following a government caseworker, Linus, who is basically tasked with, why do I keep saying basically? Who is tasked with overseeing these orphanages where magical children live, and they're isolated from other children because they're different. They're not really orphanages because no one ever really adopts them, so they're just kind of temporary foster homes for the children. And one day Linus is sent to investigate a special orphanage where there are extra magical children who are supposedly dangerous, and Linus has to report on the orphanage and recommend whether it can stay open or not. It's a story about love and acceptance, and as Klune himself said in an interview, kindness. Linus, how do I not spoil this? Well, but again, it's very obvious from the beginning. So Linus goes to visit this orphanage, and he meets Arthur, who is the headmaster, sort of, the head of the orphanage, and he meets all the children, and he ends up making his recommendations based on his interactions with the children. So this orphanage is on an island, which is a little bit distant from the village. You can only reach it by ferry. So he also visits the village with the children, and overall it's just a story about how Linus comes to understand that we're not labels. We can't be labeled by the government or institutions or basically anyone. But I can't review this book without addressing the controversy that surrounded it. I think a few months ago, even though now it's old news, I personally think this book is worth reading, even considering the controversy. Klune said in an interview that while the idea of magical children segregated in foster homes had been buzzing around his head for a while, everything clicked into place only when he learned about the 60s scoop and residential schools. A really dark moment in Canadian history where indigenous children were separated from their families and put into residential schools following a misguided idea of cultural integration. And Klune in this interview cited this specific historical tragedy as part of the inspiration for his novel, which sparked a relatively big controversy with people changing their ratings, previously having loved the novel and changing it to say from 5 stars to 1 star, and other readers deciding not to read the book at all because of this. The main accusation is that he was telling a story that wasn't his to tell and profiting from the pain and trauma that indigenous people endured. I'm not indigenous, and this is only my opinion. And clearly I cannot be triggered by this, so it's not even my place to say what can and can't be triggering. And I believe everyone's feelings on the matter are valid, but I've seen that even among indigenous readers, at least on the internet, there isn't a monolithic position on the matter, even on behalf, as I said, of indigenous readers who have commented on this. One reader in particular stood out to me. She posted a video on Instagram, I'll link it down below if I can find it, where she said that she actually appreciated the note of hope which Klune's book ended on, and that she didn't need to be reminded of the terrible consequences of the whole situation because she was one of those consequences, and that she also felt like redirecting anger at the writer was probably the wrong way to go about it, since it's easy to just sit behind a keyboard and type out a furious review and pull the rating from 5 stars to 1 star. but that's not effectively doing anything because it's not targeting who is really responsible for the situation, i.e. the government or the institutions, and it won't have the same impact that, say, a protest would have. And I have to say, I agree with this. First of all, if TJ Klune hadn't mentioned the source material, that the residential schools were source material, I doubt anyone would really have drawn a parallel between the story and the 60s scoop, since the resulting story is so fundamentally different. And as far as the writers being inspired by historical events, I feel like so many fantasy and non-fantasy writers draw on history for source material. And I also feel like even if you're not trying, your story can come out as similar to certain historical events. I remember another review that stuck with me when I read it because this reviewer said, can you imagine if someone did the same thing with the Holocaust? But writers have done that. They have done the same thing with the Holocaust. There are so many books based on it that are actual retellings and aren't just loosely inspired, and movies as well. And some are sensitive to the issues and some aren't. Some are terrible and offensive and insensitive. And maybe some push too far with attempting to make light of a situation that was actually tragical. For example, Jojo Rabbit was met with similar controversy. So yes, it probably isn't TJ Klune's story to tell, but I also feel like he didn't tell it because the resulting story is just so far and so different from the source material. He also then goes on to mention that he researched the topic and found that the same thing had happened in other countries as well. So I feel like in any case, it wasn't based solely on the 60s scoop. And context also comes into play because at the time when TJ Klune's interview came out, the Canadian government announced the finding of 215 bodies of Indigenous children at a residential school site. So clearly the whole incident blew up way more than it would have otherwise. I'm not saying that obviously this should be minimized. I just think that the connection between the two incidents made the whole thing bigger. And one more thing I want to say is, doesn't intention count for anything? I mean, it's clear in his interview that he knew that he was tackling a difficult subject and he was actually trying actively to not offend anyone. And maybe he didn't manage that. And maybe this isn't enough either. Definitely this isn't enough. But surely we can't put this on the same level as authors who have actively written or not even tried to stay away from offensive or insensitive material, and then they have defended their choices without apologizing. And finally, on a personal level, the controversy actually generated a number of positive effects. Essentially, now many more people know about the 60s scoop and residential schools because, as I'm sure most of you know, it isn't something that is widespread knowledge or something that you learn at school. And I find that to be just awful, frankly. I'm not American or Canadian, and I didn't know anything about this. As I mentioned, I find this mind-blowing, like how certain things happened and you don't know it unless you were part of the actual event. So again, this is only my opinion, but I feel like TJ Klune's mention of the 60s scoop as inspiration for his story essentially helped spread the knowledge about a tragedy that needs to be known and showcase the incompetence of a global school system which essentially fails to educate on really important, relevant events, and a government which not too far back, and we're talking 1950s to 1980s, thought that it was okay to separate Indigenous children from their families. And this can't be pinned, in my opinion, on an author as a scapegoat. I feel like that doesn't do anything to actively resolve the situation. Frankly, if TJ Klune was insensitive, I'm not saying that he wasn't. I can't really comment on that because, once again, I'm not Indigenous, so none of the book was triggering or upsetting for me in any way because I just didn't make the connection until after I read it, and I'm not sure I ever would have if I didn't come across some Reddit subforums. But if TJ Klune was insensitive, that's also because most people aren't equipped to address trauma on this scale. And this is not a justification, but once again, because we mostly aren't aware of it. And I'm not saying this, again, to justify TJ Klune, but rather to emphasize the fact that things need to change, and actually the fact that people are talking about this and that his book sparked a discussion on the matter is a step in the right direction. I'd like to read a little bit of that interview just to give a little bit more context. Where is my phone? History, as it does with terrifying consistency, was repeating itself once again. Let me be upfront about something. I'm a white dude. There really isn't much I should be preaching about. I'm queer, and a loud one at that. But the marginalization I've faced because of this isn't to be compared to others facing bigotry. It's not a contest. It sucks across the board, but I'm a mid-30s cis man in America. I'm privileged in ways others are not. I know this. So when I wrote Cerulean, I knew I had to do so carefully to make sure that what I decided on to be the central theme of the story wouldn't be lost. So he knows that he's talking about a delicate subject matter, which can potentially be upsetting, and maybe he didn't deal with it in the right way. But he seems like an intelligent person who, after this, will definitely think not twice, but a million times on anything else he writes to make sure it's not offensive or insensitive. Hopefully, I hope I don't have to come back here and realize I was wrong. In my case, personally, reading the book and the controversy was beneficial because now I know about this particularly dark period of Canadian history, and I find it insane that I had no idea, like not even an inkling, that this ever happened. Obviously, and I'll repeat, these are just my opinions as someone who is not indigenous, and I just want to say it again that all feelings are valid. The one thing I would say is to read the book and make up your own mind. Let me know in the comments if you agree with me or disagree, and please know that I'm not trying to reignite controversy. I just read the book really late, and I felt like I couldn't justify a high rating, seeing as I read it after the controversy sparked without discussing it. So that's why I decided to make this video. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!